Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ruth, for that wonderful blessing and keeping us grounded. It was deeply appreciated. And thank you, welcome, everyone. It's so terrific to be here. So it's true, I'm from Mars. Who's been to Mars? Okay, so you have an official invitation to come to Mars, and for those of you that are tweeting, you can put hashtag PFC 2019, already taking us to other worlds. Right, so we're going to kick this off really well. So Mars was founded by a visionary philanthropist, like many people in this room. Dr. John Evans believed that we could take divergent thinkers, like entrepreneurs and scientists and inventors and investors, and bring them all together for convergent action. So thinking is not enough. We actually need to act on it. That's why he created the space that is Mars. It's about 1.5 million square feet in downtown Toronto. We need more spaces like that. We need the space for deliberative discussion critical to our democracy, which appears to be shrinking and to be more fragile in an era of anger and populism. Today, we want to explore the role of philanthropy in helping to strengthen civic space for dialogue and action for the common good. Listen, it's clear we face some pretty dire challenges that require us all to work together, like climate change. How many people were at the event last night? Yeah, great. I'm so glad so many people made it. It was terrific, and congratulations to everyone that was involved. It's really exploring in this context, how can philanthropy help us build bridges between people and stakeholders with deeply divergent views? Is it possible to stay above the political fray while working on complex challenges that require new, transformative, and collective action? What is the role of politics, partisan and otherwise, when our pluralistic society requires a range of iterative and evidence-based solutions? And what is the role of philanthropy? Are we intentionally doing all we can to bring those diverse opinions to the tables? So to reflect on that, we're going to kick off with a discussion from Calgary's Mayor, Naheed Nenshi. So the mayor was sworn in as the 36th mayor of Calgary in 2010 and was subsequently re-elected in 2013 and 2017. Prior to being elected mayor, Mayor Nenshi was with McKinsey & Company. Then he formed his own business to help public, private, and nonprofit organizations grow. He designed public policy for the government of Alberta, helped create a Canadian strategy for the Gap, Banana Republic, and Old Navy, and he worked with the United Nations to determine how business can help the poorest people on the planet. He then entered academia, where he was Canada's first tenured professor in the field of nonprofit management at Mount Royal University. For his work, he was named a Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum, was awarded the President's Award from the Canadian Institute of Planners, and received the Humanitarian Award from the Canadian Psychological Association. This was for his contribution to mental health, something which is really predominant and big challenges that we face. In 2013, after his stewardship of the community during the devastation of the flooding, Maclean's magazine called him the second most influential person in Canada after the Prime Minister. And this is my favorite. He was also awarded the 2014 World Mayor Prize by the UK-based City Mayors Foundation as the best mayor in the world. Like, that's awesome. Yeah. Right. In 2016, he was honored by Elder Pete Standing Alone with the Blackfoot name, and I didn't have a chance to talk to the mayor about how to pronounce it, so I'm going to give him the opportunity to pronounce it. I wouldn't try unless I could get it right. And it means clan leader, and it's one who moves camps and others follow, because there's no point in being a leader if no one's following you. In 2016, Elder Bruce Starley also honored him with the name that means always ready. So he holds a Bachelor of Commerce with distinction from UCalgary, where he was president of the Students Association. He has a master's in public policy from John F. Kennedy School at Harvard, where he attended as a fellow. And for those of you who were listening to CBC while making your Thanksgiving dinner, you will know that we have here the proud winner of the Because News quiz. Congratulations, Mayor Nenshi. We look forward to your remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Alyson. Thank you, Awatanaki, Ruth, for being here today. And thank you all for being in this beautiful windowless conference room on this beautiful autumn day for the whole day, thinking big thoughts. So, Alyson, your introduction there made me think, gee, I have this beautiful speech here, which I may not give in any way. Because I was actually thinking about how we wanted to have this conversation today, and in fact, what you wanted from me. Should I give you wisdom from on high on how to solve these problems? Should I give you a Tony Robbins-style motivational speech to start your day? Should I make you feel good about yourselves and all the great work that you do in communities across this country and around the world? Or should I just be really muddled, as I normally am, about extremely complicated and messy questions, because human beings are complicated and messy? So maybe a little bit of all of those things. But really, in the context of starting off what I hope will be a very real, very frank, and sometimes very difficult conversation. And I think that it's a conversation that every single one of us has to have. So I'm invoking the Chatham House rule, because I'm going to say some pretty frank things to you about how the community in which we live, how we need to be able to move forward, and how we need to be able to work together. Let me start, of course, by welcoming you here. We're thrilled to have all of you here. And I do want to say thank you for the extraordinary work you do in all of your communities. As you heard, I've spent a lot of time in the nonprofit sector. I've spent a lot of time with foundations. I've spent a lot of time with philanthropy, and I understand the importance of the extraordinary work that you do every single day. So thank you for that, and thank you for taking the time to come here to sharpen your saw a little bit and to think about how we can be even more impactful and even better in a world that is increasingly confusing. So I was in this building yesterday, and as I was walking down the street, I happened to notice a half a block ahead of me a young, very small teenage girl with pigtails walking down the street, and realized, well, that's Greta Thunberg. What is she doing walking down Stephen Avenue? And I did not talk to her, but I did send one of my colleagues over to see her and say, hey, do you want to say hi to the mayor? He's right behind you. And she wanted to have a day without meeting people and cameras, and wanted to see Calgary, which I was excited about. So I didn't actually talk to her, but I was reflecting a little bit on her visit here. When it was announced that she was coming here, the reaction here in Calgary was extraordinarily polarized. And it ranged from, you're not welcome here, through, please come here so that we can tell you how great we are, to, please come here so that we can tell you how great we are. And even my own reaction was, you know, you're very welcome, we're thrilled to have you, we'd love to tell you a little bit about what we're doing on climate here in Calgary. And then I realized that every single one of those responses was saying either you're not welcome here, which I thought was disgusting, or even those who thought they were being welcoming were actually saying, you're welcome here so we can talk at you. You're welcome here so we can educate you. You're welcome here so that we can lecture you. And just about nobody in all that crazy reaction online and in line at the Tim Hortons, just about nobody actually said, you're welcome here because we want to listen to you. You're welcome here because we want to learn from you. You're welcome here because we're interested in how a 16-year-old young woman can go from sitting all by herself in front of the Swedish Parliament and 1 year later inspire 4 million people to march in the streets to talk about their concerns about climate. And nobody said that. And I thought to myself, all right, so where are we that we're not particularly interested in talking to other people with whom we might disagree? When I talk to people across the community, and this would not surprise any of you, I bet every single one of you have had this same conversation maybe over those Thanksgiving tables. We talk about a world where our community is increasingly divided and increasingly polarized, and we talk about the need to get beyond this division and polarization. But too often, that also means that we want to get beyond the polarization by hoping that the people with whom we disagree shut up and go away. And then the polarization will be done. But that's not actually how we get beyond all of that. And in fact, one other interesting thing happened when Greta announced that she was coming, which is my phone started blowing up with people from the energy sector who wanted to engage in a dialogue with, not just with her, but to use her visit as an opportunity to engage in a dialogue with the community. As it turns out, she was only in Calgary as a tourist. She's up to Edmonton now, participating, I think, in a climate strike tomorrow there. But what was really interesting is when I mentioned that back to some of these senior oil and gas executives, they said, you know what, let's have this dialogue anyway. Let's put energy CEOs in a room with high school students so they can actually hear what 16-year-olds are talking about, and they can help understand where they need to go. Because a lot of these thoughtful energy leaders, and there are thoughtful energy leaders, actually have realized that if they don't get this right, if they don't understand how to deal with climate and energy together, how to make sure that we continue to provide safe, clean, green, convenient energy to people, which I happen to believe is the most powerful poverty-fighting tool we have. And if we don't do that in a way that stewards our land, our air, and our water, then future generations will never forgive us for what we did. You know, it's common now to hear politicians talk, and I believe it, and it's important, to talk about how debt and deficit now is an intergenerational problem. That when we spend beyond our means now, we end up saddling our kids and grandkids with the bill. That's absolutely true. Climate is the exact same thing. When we spend our climate budget now, we saddle our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids with a bill that they may never actually be able to pay. And as we get to that conversation, that, I think, is how we actually move forward in this. But it's hard. And you know, if I was going to be here and be all Tony Robbins motivational about it, I would tell you great things like, our job is to get the right people in the room. Our job is to understand that authentic dialogue and inquiry trumps advocacy every time. Our job is to write the other side's victory speech for them. But I don't know if I believe that. I think it's helpful. I think it's important for us to be able to use our convening power to get different kinds of people with different thoughts in the room. But in this era of division and populism and pluralism and polarization, I don't know if I want to write the other side's victory speech. Because maybe the other side are really bad people who want really bad things and things that are not right for our community or for all of us. So what do we do if we are in a situation like that? How do we manage through that conversation? And how do we ensure that we are open-minded enough to hear other sides, but not so open-minded that we abandon the values on which we are based? It's a tough question. And I don't think that I know the answers. I think your brilliant panel today, including me, but the other brilliant people, will actually solve this whole problem for you. I'm not sure that I can. I'll give you another personal example. I currently have the great honor and privilege of working with the City Council that the most generous thing anyone has said about our City Council in the last year is that it is wholly dysfunctional. Usually it's a bit ruder than that. So what do I do in a situation like that? I mean, I'm the mayor. I'm the one who gets to come and speak at podiums. But at the same time, I'm only one of 15 votes around that table. And if 7 of them don't agree with me, then I don't get anything done. And some of them, frankly, sometimes are wholly unreasonable. As one of them mentioned to me this week, we have such important work to do. We have such important decisions to make. And so many of our colleagues are like children playing in the dust, fighting about meaningless things, taking pot shots at one another. For the past year, very cognizant of the fact that I need at least 7 of them to agree with me on everything, I tried to be very open, very welcoming to different points of view. I tried to be accommodating, and I tried to really work hard to help everyone move their agenda forward. For my pains, we were rewarded with the lowest approval rating of any city council in the history of polling. Okay, maybe I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but not much. And in fact, city council did a couple of super boneheaded things that I actually enabled because I wanted to make sure that everyone had their voice. And I spent some time thinking over the summer about, all right, so why isn't this working? And the question that I had, and the provocative question that I want to put forward to you is, when is collaboration too much? When is it a step too far? When does leadership actually mean shutting out some voices? When does leadership actually mean setting boundaries and saying these are the bounds within which behavior is acceptable? Now, I don't have kids, but people who have kids keep telling me children love boundaries. So I tried that. And that didn't work either. In fact, it may have made things worse. So the question then becomes, how in the world do we actually move forward in a way where we call out bad behavior? In a way where we try to unify people behind a common goal, behind what's good and right, or at least what we think is good and right, while at the same time not falling victim to arrogance and thinking that our way is the only way. So I'll give you another example, and then we'll get into this panel discussion. But I have chosen, as you heard a little bit in that very generous introduction, I really have to shorten that introduction, that I work a lot on issues of community mental health. And I have decided that the cornerstone of my third term as mayor, by the way, yesterday was my second anniversary of my third term as mayor. Actually, tomorrow, Nancy, my colleague, is here with me, and I wonder if she realizes this. Tomorrow is actually the anniversary of the day I was first elected as mayor. And in fact, tomorrow I become the third longest serving mayor in Calgary's history. So it's a little bit of an anniversary celebration, and it's all Nancy's fault. But I don't know why I went into that. The cornerstone of my third term as mayor is a focus on community mental health and addiction. And I want to spend a minute talking to you about that and how we're thinking about that in the context of working over boundaries across sectors and in a collaborative model. Every community in this country, in fact, every community in the Western world, probably every community in the world, is facing a crisis of mental health of unmitigated proportions. Some of it's obvious. Here in Calgary, we lose 5 people a week to opioid overdose. Meth has become prevalent throughout our community, forcing people to be violent and unpredictable and difficult. In fact, in terms of meth, when you chat with people who are users, sometimes they say to you, you say, why do you use this dangerous, dangerous drug? And sometimes they say to you, well, it actually keeps me awake and it keeps me warm. And because I don't feel safe on the streets or in the shelter system, this helps me stay up all night and stay safe. And then I can sleep it off the next day at the library or at the Tim Hortons. So in a really weird way, some of the users of that dangerous drug are using it as a rational response to the environment that they're in. But of course, it's completely irrational. It makes you violent, it makes you unpredictable, it causes your teeth to fall out, and you will die. But how are we putting people in a situation like that? So some of the aspects of the mental health and addictions crisis are visible. Many are not. 1 in 4 Canadians will struggle with mental illness in their lifetimes. Every single one of us either has had a struggle ourselves with mental illness or have that in our families. Every single one of us. And we never, ever talk about it. And so it's clear that no community anywhere in North America, in the Western world, maybe in the world, has really figured this out. And so I decided that I would take this term, this gift that I've been given, to really focus on this issue. And I've given the team that is working on this a very easy task, a very low bar. And the task is 5 years from now, I want communities around the world to say, we need to adopt the Calgary model. The only problem is I have no idea what the Calgary model is. I just know it doesn't exist. And so when they came back to me and said, you know, Mayor, how do we do that? What is the Calgary model? I said, listen, the one thing you got to know about me is I'm not very smart. And I only have one solution to every problem. And my one solution to every problem is take a systems-wide view and put the person you're trying to help at the center of the system. That's all I got. But in the mental health and addiction space, we do exactly the opposite of that. We defend our turf in terms of the treatment modality that we have or the path we think works. We try to make that universal for everyone. We focus on the bureaucracy and the funding more than on the person we're trying to help. There is no way of tracking a person through their journey from beginning to end. You never know if the person who's using a supervised consumption site or a harm reduction site is actually accessing treatment. You never know about whether the mental health or the addiction is the chicken or the egg, and where things started and how you manage through this system. And so that's why we set up this cross-boundary collaboration in terms of thinking about mental health, including many of the people in this room who come from Calgary. Because we think that the key is getting everyone in the room together. And I was actually was I in this room? I think it might have been in this room for a conference a couple of weeks ago that had basically harm reduction people and treatment people in the room sitting on opposite sides of the room staring at one another warily. And what I said was, the one thing we have to do is understand that not one path works for everyone. We have to understand that there are those that would pit us against one another. And we have to understand that we're all in this together. And we have to be able to figure out how to work this out together. And that really, for me, is an example of this cross-boundary collaboration. The only job I've got is to convene. I have the ability, and I have a little bit of money, but not much, but I have the ability to bring people together in a room, from government, people with lived experience, funders, donors, nonprofits, health services, the police, all into a room together and say, all right, let's talk about this together. We all have different lenses, but every single one of us has one thing in common, which is we care deeply. We want to keep people alive, and we want to help people get better, and we want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to live a life of dignity. It's not easy, but it's important. And I think that the work that we do, that you all do every single day in your own areas, is critical, because that convening power matters. Because as foundations, you've got a little power, the power of the purse, which can get people in a room. And using that, I think, is very, very important for us to think about how to get to these tough conversations. You know, I often say that real change in our community doesn't happen because good-looking politicians with great hair and purple ties make speeches. I don't know any of those people. It happens because everyday people make it happen. And I always say that everyday people with their everyday hands, their everyday hearts, their everyday voices, and their everyday minds are the people who make change. But I think I've missed something when I say that. And I think perhaps our strongest tool is, in fact, our everyday ears. And that, in these times of division and anger and mean-spiritedness, I think might be our most important tool. Because our job as human beings, our job as Canadians, our jobs as people blessed to live in this place, is to ensure that in these difficult times, those voices of anger and division and meanness and hatred that are growing louder and louder and louder, that in these times where it feels like those that want to tear us apart and pull us down are prevailing over those that want to bring us together and lift us up. In these times, it's our job to ensure that meanness and division and hatred can never, never, never win. That we take a stand, that right here on this land, in this place, we commit to understanding that kindness and compassion and service and love will always win. That's our job. Thank you all.
So I'm going to invite Laurie and Allan to come on up now, please. And thank you very much, Mayor. And I think you've given us a challenge. So let's get into the really tough issues. I'll just quickly introduce our panelists. Many of you know Allan Northcott, who is the president of the Max Bell Foundation. So he's been working in the charitable sector for over 25 years in post-secondary think tanks and foundation settings. He's advised on strategy and communications with lots of organizations, and he currently serves as the chair of the board of the Philanthropic Foundations of Canada. He's been with the foundation since '98 and is doing amazing work in the area of policy. He worked in lots of other areas, University of Calgary, academia, and he's worked on a very cool project, including managing a project aimed at broad citizen access to the internet. And Laurie is the Director of Community Investment and Social Innovation at Suncor Energy. She's been an advocate in environmental and social issues for many, many years, and she spent 15 years working in educational environmental organizations before joining SEF and Suncor in 2004, so she's got a deep appreciation of the diversity of perspectives that are needed. She's always seeking new approaches and new possibilities to solving our toughest challenges. So I'm going to join them on the panel. I'm going to start actually, see if this works. I'll start at the end, just to throw you off a little bit, which is, Mary, you sort of gave us a challenge. Have you read Adam Kahane's book, Collaborating with the Enemy?
It has been sitting on my desk for 6 months, and I haven't cracked the cover yet.
Okay, it is like you can read it in half an hour.
It's a great title.
It's a great title because the subtitle is not something I wrote down. The subtitle is something like, how do you collaborate with people you don't like, trust, or... No, yeah, really, it's a good title. Adam's that guy, right? But you can read it super quickly. So if you can find half an hour in your day, I recommend it. Here's the description. Collaboration is increasingly difficult and increasingly necessary. Often to get something done that really matters to us, we need to work with people, here we go, we don't agree with, like, or trust. Adam Kahane has faced this challenge many times working across important areas like democracy, the job market, and climate change, and on everyday issues that occur in organizations, in families. Did you all survive Thanksgiving? You're all here. Through these experiences, he's learned that our conventional understanding of collaboration, that it requires a harmonious team that agrees on where it's going and how it's going to get there and who will do what, is wrong. Instead, we need a new approach to collaboration that embraces discord, experimentation, and genuine co-creation. So I wanted to see how that quote resonated with each of you, but I'm going to give you a break, and I'm going to ask Laurie to kick off with that, because I know you have read the book.
Yeah, I have read the book, and I've done the workshop.
Yeah, great.
And lived that every day. A couple of examples come to mind in that regard. So for all of you who were here last night, and you heard the presentation in Chad Park from the Energy Futures Lab in particular talk. By the way, I think I vote Chad for Prime Minister. His ability to take such diverse perspectives and turn it into something really generative is quite profound. Getting to the starting point of the lab, though, was a place of discord. We started a conversation with Chad about that possibility and with the natural step probably 18 months before it became live. And it started with a really tough conversation between Chad and another one of his colleagues in reflecting back to us the challenge that their board had in working with the Suncor Energy Foundation and Suncor in particular. Would it be genuine, authentic to enter into that kind of a partnership around what we were calling at that point a Sustainability Transition Lab, eventually becoming the Energy Futures Lab as the theme, but how authentic would it be to enter into a relationship with us when they were really trying to move to a more sustainable economy? So, we probably we had a couple of tough conversations around that. We knew it was possible, but we needed to uncover what were the risks involved for everybody. And it really was a 12 to 18 month process, a conversation around what do we do together. So, and then certainly within the lab itself, I know Chad alluded to it a bit last night, not easy conversations within the lab. We have a couple of folks who are fellows there, and what they're learning and bringing back into our organization and having an influence there is also thorny, but generative, and that's the bit that we focus on.
Thank you. Allan.
Hello. Maybe I would just add maybe a different lens on the question. So, you know, the Max Bell Foundation supports work that's aimed at informing public policy. So we don't do that ourselves. We're actually quite agnostic. We don't have a view on the way the world should look, except that charities, civil society organizations, should be at the policy development table, right? And one of the challenges that we encounter and have encountered over, we've been doing this work for 20 years now, is a lot of charities are tooled up to do campaigns, right? To sort of change the public discourse or have a particular viewpoint heard more loudly, which is wonderful and essential and fantastic. The slippage is when a policy decision has to be made. And of course, governments have to govern for everyone. So one particular perspective seldom can carry the day. And what happens is a lot of charities are built to do this kind of campaigning work and not built to compromise, to negotiate, to find common ground and build a workable solution, right? I mean, there are some, right? But it just tends not to be sort of woven into the organizational DNA, right? So you know, that is really essential. I think that more organizations, and my view, I don't have any data on this, but my impression is more organizations in the charitable sector in Canada are moving in that direction because they see that that's the way to get things done.
So one of the things that Adam talks about, and at the risk of sounding like Adam's publisher here, his previous book was called Power and Love. And he says you need both power and love. You got to figure out when you're talking about your own self-interest and then about the self-interest of others. Space for experimentation and deep listening. And then really the only way you can solve a problem is to try to solve it. And so he talks about plunging into the action. So Mayor, would you like to comment on any of those?
Yeah, you know, a lot of these tactics and tools I think are very helpful, particularly when thinking about bureaucratic or hidebound organizations, and we know there are none of those in the nonprofit sector. That was a joke. But the challenge, I think, is, and I know he does talk about this, is how you define the problem and how you ensure that folks in the room are thinking at the same time horizon of that problem. And this is where I think things get challenging. So I'm just being a bit devil's advocate with all of you today, because what if there are people in the room who don't actually recognize the problem, who don't see it the same way? You know, so for example, you know, here in Alberta, we've gone through some interesting politics lately, and I think even the provincial government, although they won't say it publicly, recognizes that they've made a mistake, which is in their campaigning against the carbon tax as a tool of dealing with climate change, they opened the door for climate change skeptics and deniers to take a real strong place at the policy table when before they were marginalized. So in fact, in the previous provincial election, actually two provincial elections ago, I would argue to you that one of the reasons the then Wild Rose Party didn't win the election is because the then leader, Danielle Smith, was seen as being soft on climate change. And she was actually seen as coddling climate change deniers, and that was unacceptable, even in Alberta, in the political discourse. She now has a radio show in which she denies climate change all the time. And so it's really interesting to see how that policy window has shifted. And even the provincial government if you listen to the Premier lately, when he's not talking about the federal election, he will actually use lines like, we must reduce our emissions, the carbon tax is a lousy way of doing that. So he's actually shifted to start talking about the reality of the problem, but is it too little too late? And so these tactics that you're talking about, fast failure, experimentation, pilots, are things we're really trying to do in government. It's very alien to government DNA, but we're trying to do it. The challenge is if people don't actually agree on the problem. So, you know, in my own city council, I often get frustrated because I think to myself, well, geez, your metric of success is your Facebook likes, or your metric of success is getting yourself in the paper. Your metric of success is not the long-term sustainability and success of the community. And I've tried very hard to shift people's mindsets over, but I failed every time. So it's hard to get into the fast pilots when no one agrees on what you're trying to actually achieve.
Yeah, in the world of labs and people who work in the lab space and the social innovation space, the first thing you got to do is try to figure out what the problem is you're going to work on, which is you're not going to get agreement on everything, but you can agree that this is a carpet. Like, find something, and the strategy about sort of winning people over is never going to work. And so I suggest anytime you have the value of a third party to bring them in, and they can bring the diverse perspectives, and certainly we talk about those with lived experience, which in the case of climate change is pretty well all of us. So Lori, in the cross-sectoral world, you are often there representing the corporate sector. And there are lots of people that have challenges like you talked about with your work with the Energy Futures Lab. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How do you get the strength to go to those kind of meetings knowing how challenging it is? Because I think you've got something to offer, but I'm interested in your perspective.
I'm looking to the table back there, that much of the team is there. We get our strength from one another, certainly within our team. It's exhausting. I'll be just frank. You know, we are constantly dancing that line. But what I'd say is comforting is that we're not working out of an alignment with our organization, right? So the things that we value and that we believe are valued by the organization that we work for. So that's super helpful. I don't think we'd be able to be in those kinds of spaces if we didn't know that they kind of had our back. But it's also our role as a corporate foundation to be disruptive. And the work that we do is as much about disrupting internally into the organization as it is externally. And we often are looking for opportunities to partner and collaborate and be in relationship with others who help us to do that work as well, because we see the opportunity. Chad, last night, again, I'm riffing off of his comments a bit because he did such a great job of it, but he talked about that spectrum of skills that are required. And I think that that's what we find in particular, that as we move along that spectrum into the soft skills, that's where we reside. And it's, it takes for me personally, it takes a lot of self-care as well, right? To tend to those skills, to tend to what it means to be in those difficult conversations. And I go back to you referring to that Adam's book, Power and Love, and that's a quote that comes from Martin Luther King, and I think about that a lot, because you can't, I tend to come from a place of compassion, and I recognize that I also at the same time represent a place of power and privilege. And so I'm, again, constantly living that tension as well, and how to use those two things to our greatest advantage. No, I've got more to say about that, but I'm respecting time.
No, that's a terrific answer. And I think, again, in the world of social innovation, we need to hold both. And often we hold these paradoxes and we try to live with them. And that's where the innovation comes, I think. So, but it's incredibly challenging. So if we're still staying with the Mayor's Chatham House rules, I will tell you, as I was on these, okay, only government could come up with this name, the Social Innovation and Social Finance Strategy Co-Creation Steering Group. Right. And so it's a federal task force, 17 of us. We were there to create a social innovation and social finance strategy for Canada. We could barely agree that this was a carpet. It was a very, very challenging group, and welcome to working across Canada, right? I mean, it was really challenging. But the most frustrating thing was there was absolutely no receptor capacity within innovation for what we were within government for the innovation we were trying to introduce. No receptor capacity at all. And so we've been spending a lot of time working. One of the interesting groups I find in the federal government is Public Health Agency of Canada. They've done some very cool things. So we're doing a whole training program on innovation, social innovation, and social finance, just to deeply immerse them on what it means to, say, encourage vaccines, people to do, to actually get vaccinated, get their kids vaccinated, et cetera. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the municipal level, at the provincial level. So can you talk a little bit about your work with governments and how they receive the kind of innovations that you're trying to bring in?
Yes.
Say more, Allan.
Yeah. Well, Okay, so receptor capacity, I think, is always an issue, right? And, I think it's a two-way street. And maybe that's where I would go with that. I also want to come to another point. But, for these kinds of things to work, right, I think for an innovation, whether it's a policy innovation or whether it's a social program or, what have you, both parties, the innovator themselves, and then, if you're thinking about scaling it, you want it to be taken up in government by policy, both sides kind of have to understand what the limitations the other one's working within, right? And governments typically work on we sort of have a lot of lines for this, but one is they don't want it, 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 and then they want it right now. Right, and that's sort of how this kind of thing goes.
And then they don't do anything with it.
Right. And on the other side, if you're working on this innovation table, there's a lot of very difficult, trying work. It takes place over a long period of time, and you've got constraints about building trust among your network and understanding each other, all of those sorts of things. A very different set of constraints, and I think often these two sort of systems don't really understand very well what the constraints the other one is looking at. So let me make one more point, if I may, on that. A woman called Joanne Schroeder at University of British Columbia just completed a term as a Max Bell Foundation Senior Fellow. So she was working with the Human Early Learning Partnership, and this actually, I think, goes to some of the comments the mayor made off the top. The problem that they were trying to solve in the project that Joanne led was there are a lot of vulnerable youth and families who are being served by multiple different systems, right? They have health, they have education, they have social services, and on and on and on it goes. These systems sort of have the life of their own, a structure of their own that they reproduce, and it turns out the kid in the middle of it is getting short-changed, right? So it's not because of any ill will on the part of anyone in any of the systems, they just don't know how. They've got 1,000 things they have to do before noon today. They've got 50 other clients, all of this sort of stuff, right? They don't really know how to connect with people in the other system. So they did this really kind of novel thing. They flipped the order of what Chad gave us last night, and they make the personal part the first part, right? You get the people in a room, you talk to each other as human beings, right? You work through what your anxieties are. What makes you mad? What are you frustrated about, right? What is it you want to achieve? You spend the time, you slow down, spend the time to do that. Then you start talking about how the systems can link together. And they did a really interesting pilot and had some very, very positive results. So, that might be one fruitful way forward.
If I may, I think that I may have to leave before the end of the panel because I do have to go bang a gavel at City Council. And as you heard earlier, they can't be trusted to be alone. So that is not true. I'm just being mean now. They'll be fine. But I do have a report I have to present. But I want to just riff off that, if I may, for a moment, which is, as you were all in this room, one of the challenges we always have in the sector is that we talk up here. And then when you all go home and we say, okay, so what did you learn? You go, we had great conversations and they were tough. But I think that one thing that really jumps out at what I just heard from Allan re the work that Max Bell does is something I think that all of you can think about, which is your own role as foundations in the work that you can do. Sometimes we relegate the role of foundations to be folks who write checks. Checks are very important. But I think that there are two ways in which you can help that conversation move forward. The first, as I mentioned earlier, is the Convening Authority, right? The fact that you actually have funding, and that's how I started my mental health initiative. I went to council and asked for money first. Not much money, but I got some money, $25 million. It's a big number. But to be able to say, all right, everyone, come to the room and help us talk about this. It wasn't just because of my magnetic personality. That can be helpful. But the other thing, too, to think about in addition to the convening power is, as you say, the problem is I've got a million things to do before breakfast. And whenever I'm coaching nonprofit executive directors, I always say to them, it is not selfish to take time to think about the important stuff that's not urgent. The Stephen Covey matrix, right? Important and urgent. We spend most of our time working on things that are urgent but not important. And we don't spend enough of our time working on things that are important but not urgent. And when I'm coaching executive directors, I'm forever telling them, you need to set aside the time. My favorite is the one executive director who actually went and had lunch in her car once a week and had a 2-hour lunch in her car, because that was the only time that she could actually stop and think without being interrupted about what she was able to do. I said, you could just shut your door. But the thing that you can do, and the thing that we often forget about when we're thinking about funding, is funding that kind of capacity work. Because money helps, right? When you're doing a million things before breakfast, if you have the ability to actually have some dedicated funding that's not programmatic, that is actually allowing you to think about the big stuff, that's super helpful. I'm staring at Mary Rosé. The Rosé Foundation, and Simon is there too, are brilliant at this, right? They learned from the very beginning that helping arts managers figure out how to be better managers and think long term is an important part of their granting. And that's the kind of thing I think that we can really think about, is how do we use the tools we have, convening and money, to actually create the space for the kinds of things that Allan is talking about.
So I would say Allan Mansky, who's one of my colleagues in SIG, talks about advocating with empathy. And it actually makes some sense because we do all have our limitations. So I want to make sure that we keep that at the forefront and just recognize people aren't being mean just for the sake of it. There's something else going on there. And how do we...
Oh, sometimes they're just mean.
Or sometimes they gravitate to municipal politics, evidently, if they're mean. But you know, we're sort of trying to, in all seriousness, avoid the kind of good and bad, and really try to see people in their holistic self. How do we enable them to bring larger parts of themselves? And that's this whole thing about, you know, getting to know people first. The other thing that I'm really interested in is, you know, that there's a parable or a proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. If you've had experience where that's worked, like you've actually been able to do something collectively that you couldn't have done on your own. Let's give this audience some hope. Go ahead, Laurie.
Okay, well, the Energy Futures Lab is a great one, but I've drawn on that a bit. I'd say another one that's just, it's emerging for us is earlier this year we entered into a relationship with an Indigenous Youth Advisory Council. It's probably, it's still a bit emotional and raw for me. We had our second meeting just a couple of weeks ago in St. John's. These are a group of 8 or 10 youth from all across the country. If you're around later today, actually, one of the youth council members from Stoney Nakoda is going to be here, and he's telling a little bit about the story of that. He's the storyteller from the council. We're just early on in this journey, but I know that this is something that's already changing us quite profoundly, and in ways that we probably can't even anticipate. And it's already raising all kinds of interesting questions for us as an organization, and we're being asked to think about and advocate for some fundamentally important changes in this country. And so I think that this is one of those, this is a relationship that we're tending with a great deal of care and with the kind of beautiful grace and guidance from elders and from youth that I think is going to, again, fundamentally it's changing us in some way. This week that we had in Newfoundland is probably one of the most memorable of my career so far. Watching the interaction of this youth with one of our leadership teams was awe-inspiring. I literally was on the edge of my seat the whole time. And I guess stay tuned. For me, that's the one that feels the most alive and potentially really impactful for many of us, not just within our organization, but much more broadly and with the communities where these youth are representing as well.
Great. Yeah, I'm really keen to see what happens with that. Allan?
I thought about this parable because, boy, this isn't this one that you hear all the time. Want to go fast, go alone. The problem is you might get there fast, but when you get there, you're alone. Right? I mean, if you are trying to change a system, right, whatever that means to you, pretty sure there's going to be other people there. So I don't think the question is getting there fast and going alone. The question is, where is it you want to go, And what do you want it to look like when you get there? And chances are you're going to have a lot of other people with you. So, you can't do it fast. I guess maybe that's my answer. You really can't do it fast.
So, Mayor, I know you have to leave in a few minutes. Can I give you some closing remarks?
I feel like I gave them already. But I do want to respond to this question, which is, but, see, I'm just being devil's advocate today, you actually have to get somewhere. And I think that in our sector, and boy, in government as well, sometimes it's challenging to actually get somewhere. Analysis by paralysis by analysis, right? That we think that the action of talking about something is the same as the action of doing something. And I think that's where we really have to be able to get ourselves, whether in government or in the nonprofit sector, to actually understand that we've got to move. And that's where this fast thinking, pilot and fast failure, pilot and fail stuff is actually extremely helpful, because it gets us over risk. You know, a leadership professor of mine used to love to talk about work avoidance, and work avoidance is what happens when you talk about working. And it's extremely common in our sector. So I think these are things that we have to be able to figure out how we move collectively towards a goal, because talking about it isn't going to get it done. And I think that that is something important for us to think about. What time is it? Do I have to go? Yeah, I have a few more minutes.
You said 9:25.
All right. I'm supposed to be there at 9:30, but they know I'm going to be late. So.
Are you sure? Yeah. Okay. So let's just go to lessons.
My Tsutsuna name is always ready, not always prompt.
That works. Let's talk about lessons. So let me start with you, Allan. Are there any particular lessons you'd like to leave this room with?
This is speaking from experience, right? You only ever see part of the picture. That would be my big lesson, right? You need other people to help you fill in the picture when you're trying to get something done. I know that's a bit abstract, but I'm looking around, you probably know from experience that's the case. And I think that should be the number one thing that you have in your mind when you set out to do something.
Thank you. Lori?
A really important lesson for me recently that I'm still kind of hanging on to is this notion, again, of entering into a space going, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to do about this. And then realizing I don't need to know what to do about this because we're doing it collectively and we all bring different pieces of experience and knowledge with us. So I'm letting go of that notion that I need to know it all and be able to know what to do in any given situation. Because frankly, I think we're, in some respects, we're in uncharted times. And some of the challenges that we're looking at are we don't know how to navigate through them. But acknowledging that we don't know that and that there are other people that do know that, and just listening and hearing and adapting.
So one of the things, Mayor, when you were talking about, what you do know about systems and those with lived experience, and I would say the other thing, so I think you heard I have this really cool residency in Australia. It's called A Thinker in Residence, best title ever. So good. But the thing that I love about it is they recognize as a really big island that they don't have all the answers and they've got to look elsewhere. And I'm really hoping that we can figure that out too. Like there's lots of people that have figured out so many things. Of course we have to make it ours, but why do we have to think that we have to invent absolutely everything? We don't. We can look out and we can see what worked elsewhere and bring it here. So I would encourage people to think about that as well, to add that to your repertoire of smart things.
One thing that I often forget, and I always have to remind myself, is sometimes the really tough stuff is actually really, really simple. So when we talk about mental health and addiction, it's this complex web. There's all these different players. There's all these different systems interacting with one another. But I've tried to make it very simple. Our goal is to make sure everybody lives their best possible life. And that means that people have to stay alive and they have to get better. And when you say things like that, our goal is to protect the climate while ensuring people have a decent quality of life and access to energy. Who could disagree with that? That is one way for us to be able to get beyond all this stuff and say, look, there's a simple thing here. The housing first model which has informed so many homelessness plans and had so much success in so many different communities, is based on an absolutely mind-blowing, innovative idea. The solution to homelessness is people have homes. It's not that innovative or mind-blowing, but people hadn't talked about it in those terms. And so I think that it's critical for us not to get bogged down in the complexity of the work that we do. And if there's any advice I can leave you with, it's that, which is all that stuff around fast piloting and fast failure and risk-taking is critical. We are lucky to live in a society where we are able to take risks. No one's going to get thrown in jail if we make a mistake. No one's going to lose their livelihood or their liberty or their life if we screw up. And so I think that's really the critical thing. If we can boil these things down to the problems that we can all agree need to be solved, and then try different things and use the power and the ability we have to try different things, I think that's where we can actually find some success.
Yeah, I think that's our obligation. And speaking of obligations, I know you have to go. So please join me in thanking the mayor very much.
Thanks so much. That was great. Great to see you.
So I want to thank you for that discussion. I hope we gave you what you were hoping to get. We tried to be pretty direct about it. And I just wanted to take the final few moments to reflect on what are the kind of trends that we're seeing. So there's obviously a big trend around having philanthropy move from what have traditionally been kind of transactional relationships to a demand to be much more transformational. So there's been a focus on the capacity building of individual organizations, and that's never going to get us to solving really tough, complex issues. As you heard the mayor say, that grant is important and it's really necessary to build the individual capacity of individual organizations, but if we want to get to transformation, we have to focus on issues. We have to stop thinking that it's going to be one sector, a grant, and a nonprofit. We really have to think about this multi-sectoral collaboration and how challenging that is. So how do you actually carve off those safe spaces for experimentation that the mayor was talking about? You can't experiment with that whole council. You have to create those kind of safe spaces to enable that to happen. We also see this really narrow focus around a grant. People are asking for clarity. What exactly do you want me to do when? But if you want to get to transformation, you have to embrace ambiguity. You have to go on a learning journey with those people that you're working with. That's what's going to get us to the new level of impact. Embracing ambiguity, which scares the crap out of us, but it's the only thing we're going to do. And as Lori did so beautifully, is put vulnerability at the center of that. No one has got all of this figured out, so how do we do it together? Moving from understanding the problems we're trying to solve not simply as complicated problems, but as complex problems. And so yes, the mayor's absolutely right that homelessness requires homes, but there's so many other issues around that in terms of why people don't have homes, why they don't stay in their homes, how we have wraparound supports, issues of poverty, etc. These are complex challenges. And finally, there isn't a professional, there isn't an expert, there isn't the answer. There is, in fact, a recognition that we all bring something to the table. And if we're not engaging those with lived experience, if we're not thinking about opportunities to bring divergent thinkers together, we are missing the point completely. So I'm interested in developing a framework around how do we concretely move from the transactional to the transformational for those who want to do that. And if any of what I said resonates with you, I hope you'll follow up with me and we'll continue the discussion, because I think that's what we need to do, because we can. And that's the huge opportunity. So thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you, Lori. It's always a pleasure.
And so now it's my pleasure to